The story of the homeless man. He tells what it was like before he got lost. A moving story asterisk. Michael Anderson never imagined that one day he would be telling his story while sitting on the steps of a public library, with only the clothes on his back and a plastic bag containing all his belongings. At 52 years old, with graying hair and calloused hands that had once built homes, he decided it was time to share his journey, not for pity, but so others could understand that the line between having a home and losing it was thinner than anyone would like to admit. I had everything, Michael began, his blue eyes fixed on the horizon of the city he had once called home. A 2-story house on Maple Street, a stable job as a construction supervisor, a wife I had loved for 25 years, and 2 children who were my pride and joy. Sarah was 16 and wanted to be a veterinarian. Tommy was 14 and dreamed of becoming an architect, just like I had always wanted to be. Michael's voice trembled slightly as he spoke about his family, but he continued with the determination of someone who had found strength in vulnerability. I woke up at 5 in the morning every day, had coffee with my wife Linda, and arrived at the construction site at 6 sharp. I worked for the same construction company for 18 years. They respected me. I respected the work, and I believed it would last forever. What Michael didn't know was that his life was about to crumble like a house of cards. It all started with a back pain that he ignored for months, assuming it was just the result of decades of heavy physical work. When the pain became unbearable, he finally saw a doctor and received a diagnosis that would change everything. Double herniated disc, Michael explained, his hands instinctively touching his lower back. The doctor said I needed surgery immediately, followed by months of recovery. I thought it would just be a temporary setback. I had health insurance, savings put away, and a family that supported me. How could it go wrong? The bitter irony of the situation wasn't lost on Michael. He had spent decades building homes for other people, creating solid and lasting homes. But when his own life needed a strong foundation, everything collapsed. The surgery was just the first domino to fall in a devastating sequence of events that would take him from the suburban streets he knew so well to the city streets where he now slept. I remember the last day I felt truly safe, Michael said, a single tear rolling down his face. It was a Sunday morning, and I was in the backyard with Tommy, teaching him how to use a drill. Linda was in the kitchen preparing lunch, and Sarah was studying for a biology test. It was just an ordinary Sunday morning, but now I realize it was the last moment my family was complete and my world made sense. Michael's back surgery was a medical success, but a financial disaster. Although he had health insurance through his employer, complications during recovery resulted in costs that weren't covered. Infections, additional physical therapy, and a second surgery to correct problems from the first quickly consumed his savings. I had always been careful with money, Michael explained, nervously fidgeting with the zipper of his worn jacket. Linda and I saved 20% of every paycheck. We had an emergency fund that should have lasted 6 months. We thought we were prepared for anything. But 6 months became 8, then 10, and finally a full year out of work. The construction company, which had initially promised to hold his position, eventually needed to hire a permanent replacement. Michael found himself not only unemployed, but also with physical limitations that made it impossible to return to heavy construction work. The worst part wasn't the bills coming in, Michael said, his voice heavy with pain. It was watching my family slowly disintegrate. Linda started working 2 jobs to try to keep the house. Sarah gave up her extracurricular activities to take care of me. Tommy became quiet and withdrawn, watching his father, the man he admired, become a burden to the family. The financial pressure began to affect every aspect of family life. Arguments about money became constant. Michael felt useless, unable to provide for his family for the first time in his adult life. The physical pain in his back was nothing compared to the emotional pain of watching his children go without. I tried to find other types of work, Michael continued. Office jobs, sales, anything that didn't require physical effort. But I was a 50-year-old construction man without a college education. Who would hire me when there were dozens of younger, more qualified candidates? The situation deteriorated rapidly. First, they lost the car. Then, they began falling behind on mortgage payments. Michael watched helplessly as his family sold personal belongings to pay basic bills. The house he had helped build with his own hands was being lost piece by piece. Linda told me she was considering moving with the children to her mother's house. Michael said, his voice breaking. She didn't say it was because of me, but I knew. I was dragging the whole family down with me. For the first time in my life, I began to think that maybe my family would be better off without me. Michael's decision to leave his family was the hardest of his life, but he believed it was the only way to save them from the financial ruin his medical condition had caused. On a cold March night, he wrote letters to Linda and his children, explaining that he loved them too much to continue being a burden. I told them I was leaving to find work in another city, Michael revealed, his hands shaking. It was a lie, but I needed them to move on with their lives. Linda could qualify for government assistance as a single mother. The children could have a chance at a better future without the medical debts that my name carried. Michael took only what he could carry and left behind a lifetime of memories. He had secretly saved $200 by selling some of his tools, money he hoped would last until he found work in another city. He had no idea he was about to discover how quickly someone could fall from middle class to street life. I thought it would be temporary, Michael explained. A few weeks in cheap motels while looking for work, then a small apartment, and eventually reuniting with my family. I never imagined I would become the type of person that people cross the street to avoid. The reality of street life hit Michael with full force. $200 lasted only 2 weeks in cheap motels. Without a fixed address, it was impossible to get a job. Without a job, it was impossible to get housing. He found himself trapped in a vicious cycle that seemed to have no way out. The first night I slept outdoors was the scariest of my life. Michael said, his eyes distant with the memory. I chose a park bench, thinking it would be just one night. I stayed awake until dawn, afraid of being attacked, afraid of the police, afraid that someone I knew would see me. I couldn't believe my life had come to this point. Weeks turned into months, and Michael gradually learned the unwritten rules of street life. Where to get food, where to use bathrooms, where to sleep safely, how to avoid trouble with police. Each lesson cost him a piece of his dignity and hope. I changed, Michael admitted. Not just physically, although losing 30 pounds and developing this persistent cough. I changed inside. The person I was, the husband, the father, the respected supervisor, that person was slowly dying each day on the streets. During the first months on the street, Michael maintained a prepaid cell phone, using it to try sporadic contact with his family. These conversations became increasingly painful as he heard about their lives slowly improving without him. Linda had gotten a better job, Sarah was excelling in school, and Tommy had joined the soccer team. I knew I had made the right decision, Michael said, though his voice contradicted his words. They were better without me. But hearing about their lives, knowing I wasn't there for the important moments, it killed me inside. Eventually, Michael stopped calling, partly because the phone was stolen, but mainly because he could no longer bear the pain of being connected to a life he could no longer have. He convinced himself it was better for everyone if he simply disappeared completely. I became very good at being invisible, Michael explained. You learn not to make eye contact, not to bother people, to simply exist in the spaces between other people's lives. I became a shadow of the person I used to be. Street life taught Michael brutal lessons about human nature. He saw unexpected kindness from strangers who gave him food or money, but also experienced cruel indifference from people who treated him as if he were invisible. He quickly learned that his appearance and circumstances fundamentally changed how people reacted to him. I remember one afternoon when I ran into my old neighbor on the street, Michael recounted. Bob Morrison, who lived 3 houses down from mine. We had barbecued together. Our children played together. When he saw me, I saw recognition in his eyes for just a second. Then he looked away and crossed the street. I couldn't blame him. I was a reminder that anyone could end up like me. Michael's mental health began to deteriorate along with his physical health. The depression that had begun with his back injury deepened with the isolation and hopelessness of street life. He began to doubt his own memories of having had a different life. There were moments when I questioned whether my previous family had been real, Michael admitted. When you live on the streets long enough, when people treat you like you don't exist, you start to believe that maybe you never existed. Maybe I had always been just a homeless man who created fantasies about having a family and a home. The lowest point in Michael's journey came during his second winter on the streets. Pneumonia nearly killed him, and he spent weeks in a public hospital, where staff treated him with a mixture of clinical professionalism and poorly disguised disdain. It was during this hospitalization that he had a revelation that would change his perspective. There was a nurse named Carol, Michael said, a weak smile appearing on his face. She treated me like a human being, not like a problem to be solved. She asked questions about my life, really listened to my answers. One day, she told me something that changed everything. Carol had told Michael that she could see he wasn't like many of the other homeless patients who came to the hospital. There was something in his eyes, an intelligence and dignity that hadn't been completely destroyed by street life. She encouraged him to tell his story, to remember who he used to be. She told me I wasn't defined by my circumstances, Michael continued, that I was still the same man who had raised a family, built homes, and contributed to the community. That my current situation was the result of a series of misfortunes, not character flaws. This conversation planted a seed of hope that Michael hadn't felt in months. He began to see his situation not as a permanent sentence, but as a difficult chapter in a story that was still being written. He remembered that he had skills, experience, and worth that hadn't disappeared just because he was homeless. I started volunteering at the hospital, Michael said. Small things at first, helping other patients, cleaning, organizing supplies. Carol vouched for me, and gradually other staff members began to see me as a person rather than just another homeless patient. The volunteer work gave Michael a sense of purpose he had lost. He was contributing again, helping others, using his natural leadership abilities that had made him a good supervisor. Slowly, he began to rebuild his sense of self-worth. I met other people who had fallen through the cracks, Michael explained. Veterans, former professionals, people who had lost everything to illness or economic downturns. I realized I wasn't alone, and more importantly, I wasn't uniquely broken. Through the hospital volunteer program, Michael eventually connected with a job training program for homeless individuals. His construction background and natural leadership skills made him a valuable candidate for a program that helped homeless people transition back into the workforce. 3 years after leaving his family, Michael stood in a small apartment that he could finally call his own. He had completed the job training program and found work as a supervisor for a nonprofit organization that built affordable housing. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was once again building homes, but now for people who, like him, had lost everything. I'm not the same man who left his family that March night, Michael reflected, looking around his modest but clean apartment. "I've learned things about resilience, about human nature, about the thin line between stability and catastrophe that I never could have learned any other way." Michael had reconnected with his family 6 months earlier. The reunion was emotional and complicated. Sarah was now in college studying to become a social worker, inspired by her father's story. Tommy had graduated high school and was working while deciding on his future. Linda had remarried, but she and Michael had found a way to maintain a friendship built on their shared history and love for their children. "They don't need me to be their provider anymore," Michael said, "but they're glad to have me back in their lives. My children are proud of how I survived, how I found my way back. They see me as someone who faced the worst and didn't give up." Michael's work with a nonprofit had led to him becoming an advocate for homeless individuals. He spoke at conferences, helped design programs, and worked with city officials to create better policies for addressing homelessness. His unique perspective, having experienced both sides of the equation, made him an effective voice for change. "I tell people that homelessness isn't a character flaw," Michael said. "It's a circumstance that can happen to anyone. I was a middle-class homeowner with savings and insurance, and I still ended up on the streets. The difference between me and someone who's never experienced homelessness isn't virtue, it's luck." The organization Michael worked for had helped over 500 homeless individuals find housing and employment in the past year. Each success story reminded him that his own journey through homelessness, while painful, had given him the tools and perspective to help others. "I wouldn't choose to go through what I went through," Michael concluded, "but I can't regret it entirely, because it made me who I am today. It taught me that human beings are capable of incredible resilience, that kindness exists in unexpected places, and that everyone deserves a second chance." Michael's story had gone viral on social media, inspiring thousands of people to reconsider their assumptions about homelessness. He received messages from people who had been touched by his journey, some from individuals facing their own crises who found hope in his resilience. "If someone had told me 5 years ago that I would lose everything and end up on the streets, I would have said it was impossible," Michael said. "If someone had told me 3 years ago that I would rebuild my life and find purpose in helping others, I would have said that was impossible too. I've learned that life is full of impossible things that happen anyway." As Michael prepared for another day of work, helping other homeless individuals find their way back to stability, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had lost a house, a job, and temporarily his family, but he had found something else, a deeper understanding of human strength, compassion, and the power of never giving up hope. If this story moved you and reminded you that everyone has a story worth hearing, that circumstances don't define character, and that recovery is always possible, then please subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this every week, real accounts of resilience, redemption, and the extraordinary strength of the human spirit. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that believes in second chances, compassion, and the power of never giving up on hope.